The forest had always whispered stories of the family that built their own kingdom, a dynasty born not from land or law but from obsession. Deep in the folds of the Appalachian wilderness, where sunlight struggled to touch the ground, they carved out a domain untouched by time. To the few who knew of them, they were pioneers of madness, visionaries who believed the outside world had rotted and that only through isolation could purity survive. But behind their grand wooden gates and towering walls, purity soon took on a darker meaning. In the late 1800s, when civilization was still stretching its grasp across the untamed frontiers of America, a man named Elias Wren led his family deep into the Appalachian wilderness. He was a man of immense pride and conviction, a landowner who had watched the world change around him and grown to despise what it had become. Industrial towns filled with greed, corruption, and disease convinced him that humanity had lost its soul. He spoke often of building something greater, something untouched by the poison of progress, a sanctuary where his bloodline could live pure and unbroken. With his wealth and the loyalty of his kin, Elias vanished from the maps, taking with him a small group of followers bound by his vision. For months, they journeyed into the mountains until they found a place so remote that even the nearest settlement was days away. Towering pines surrounded a wide clearing beside a river that glittered like glass, and there Elias declared that this would be their kingdom. They began to build, not just homes but a fortress of faith. Massive log structures rose from the earth, bound together by sweat, blood, and belief. Every wall was carved with symbols Elias claimed came to him in dreams, spirals, eyes, and circles that represented protection, order, and eternity. He told his family that God had chosen them to create a new Eden, one that would outlast all others, one where their children would rule long after the outside world burned itself to ash. The men worked tirelessly under his command, while the women tended fires and cared for the children who would become the kingdom's future heirs. Elias established laws that governed every breath they took. No outsiders were ever to be trusted, no one was allowed to leave without permission, and the bloodline was to remain pure to preserve what he called the divine seed. The forest around them became both shield and prison, swallowing their voices so completely that within a year, it was as if they had never existed. The world beyond forgot them, but within their walls, they thrived, at least for a time. They learned to live from the land, growing their food, hunting the beasts of the woods, and crafting tools from bone and stone. The deeper their roots grew, the deeper their faith sank into obsession. They began to believe Elias was more than just a man, he was a prophet chosen to lead them into eternity. Each night they gathered around fires that burned unnaturally bright in the mist, chanting oaths of loyalty and purity as the forest watched in silence. What began as a dream of freedom was slowly becoming something else, something that belonged to the woods more than to the world of men. As the years passed, Elias Wren's vision of an isolated paradise evolved into something far more controlling and strange. What began as a refuge from the outside world soon hardened into a kingdom ruled by absolute obedience. Elias, once seen as a father and guide, transformed into a monarch whose word carried the weight of divine law. Within their hidden settlement, he established a strict hierarchy, assigning every family member a place in what he called the Order of the Crown. At the top stood Elias himself, the self-proclaimed King of the Chosen, followed by his eldest son, who was named heir to the bloodline's sacred duty. Below them were the keepers, those entrusted with enforcing the family's rules, ensuring no one disobeyed or strayed from the path of purity. Over time, the family developed customs and codes that set them apart from any trace of human society. They created their own language, a blend of English, Latin, and symbols carved into wood and stone. Outsiders would not have recognized a single word of it. This language became the voice of their worship, used in their rituals, prayers, and oaths. To them, it wasn't just a form of communication, it was a barrier against contamination, something that separated the divine from the damned. Children were taught that speaking the old language of the outside world was a sin that weakened the spirit. The more they forgot the world beyond the forest, the holier they became. Elias's teachings grew darker with each passing season. He claimed that the bloodline had been chosen to remain untainted, that no stranger could ever enter their ranks without bringing ruin. Marriage was permitted only within the family, as he believed their purity depended on keeping their lineage sacred and intact. Those who questioned this decree were labeled as betrayers and exiled into the forest, where none ever returned. The stories told to children described these outcasts as cursed souls who lost their humanity the moment they crossed the kingdom's borders. Over time, fear replaced love, and devotion became the only form of survival. The younger generations never knew another way of life, and the world beyond their gates became a myth told only in whispers. They believed they were the last true humans, protectors of a divine promise in a world consumed by sin. Even the forest around them seemed to bend to their rituals, its silence growing heavier, its shadows deeper. The family had succeeded in building their own kingdom, but in doing so, they had sealed themselves inside a world ruled not by freedom, but by the growing madness of their own creation. As generations passed within the wooden walls of the Wren kingdom, isolation became not just a way of life but a form of worship. The family's traditions, once driven by belief in purity and divine purpose, slowly twisted into a suffocating cycle of control. The rules Elias Wren had written decades ago were no longer seen as human commandments but sacred scripture that could not be questioned. Every word, every gesture, every bond between them was dictated by the idea that their blood was holy and must never be diluted. With each generation, the outside world faded further from memory until it became something monstrous, an invisible enemy lurking beyond the tree-line. The children born into this world never knew freedom. From the moment they could walk, they were taught obedience above all else. The elders drilled them with lessons about loyalty and the dangers of curiosity. No one could leave the settlement without the blessing of the council, and those who tried were branded traitors. Stories were told about what awaited those who disobeyed, the forest spirits that would steal their faces, the outsiders who carried disease and wickedness in their blood. These tales were more than myths, they were weapons used to keep fear alive. Over time, the fear worked too well. Even whispers of rebellion became rare, drowned by the weight of ritual and surveillance. Elias's descendants ruled with the same iron will, convinced that they were protecting their ancestors' legacy. Each new leader claimed to hear the voice of the forest, guiding them to preserve the family's sacred order. Marriage was strictly arranged within bloodlines, and every union was celebrated as an offering to the purity of their lineage. But the closer the branches of their family tree grew, the more twisted it became. Children were born frail, their minds clouded, their eyes dull. Yet instead of seeing this as a sign of decline, the elders interpreted it as proof that their blood was becoming divine, too pure for the world of flesh. Disobedience was the only unforgivable sin. Those who questioned the laws or expressed a desire to leave were brought before the council. Some were never seen again, while others were made examples of, locked away in wooden cages and left to pray for forgiveness under the cold eyes of their kin. Their cries at night were said to echo through the trees, but no one dared speak of them. Inside that kingdom of silence and devotion, generations lived and died believing that the outside world had ended long ago, that only they remained, chosen to carry on the sacred blood that had begun as a dream and ended as a curse. The forest surrounding the Wren family's hidden kingdom had always carried a stillness that unsettled even the bravest souls, but as decades passed, the silence began to change. Hunters and travelers who ventured too close to the mountain started to report strange occurrences, soft flickering lights that moved through the trees as if guided by unseen hands, the faint hum of voices chanting in a language no one recognized, and shapes that vanished when approached. Some dismissed these accounts as drunken tales told around campfires, but others swore they saw figures watching from the shadows, pale and unmoving, eyes reflecting the light of the moon. As the story spread, a quiet fear took root in the nearby towns. The woods became known as cursed ground, a place where compasses spun aimlessly and sound itself seemed to bend. Those who dared to investigate rarely returned, and the few who did came back changed, eyes hollow, hands trembling, unable to speak of what they had seen. One trapper, half-starved and raving, claimed he had stumbled upon a wooden gate carved with hundreds of symbols, each one pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Beyond it, he said, stood an entire settlement swallowed by mist, its homes arranged in perfect circles, its paths lined with bones and feathers. He spoke of hearing laughter and weeping at the same time, and of faces that shifted like smoke. The men died 2 days later, his last words muttered about the forest breathing. After that, no one ventured near willingly. Local legends began to grow, blending fact and fear until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Some said the family had turned to witchcraft to preserve their bloodline, offering sacrifices to whatever ancient force ruled the woods. Others believed they had gone mad, their isolation driving them into rituals that blurred the line between devotion and blasphemy. The chanting was said to rise on certain nights when the moon hung low, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Animals avoided the area entirely, and even birds refused to fly over it. For those living on the edges of the forest, the fear became a part of daily life. Parents warned their children never to follow the sound of singing in the woods, no matter how soft or familiar it seemed. The deeper truth of what happened inside the Wren family's kingdom remained hidden, but the woods themselves carried the echoes, lights that moved without flame, whispers that mimicked human voices, and a sense that something ancient watched from between the trees, waiting for anyone foolish enough to cross its border. When word of the strange happenings in the forest began to spread beyond the nearby towns, it eventually reached a traveling priest named Father Alistair Gray, a man known for venturing into forgotten places to root out sin and superstition. He had heard whispers of a family who called themselves divine rulers, who spoke a language not of men, and who had built a kingdom away from God's light. Drawn by both faith and curiosity, he made the journey into the mountains, determined to bring salvation, or at least understanding, to those lost souls. The locals warned him not to go. They told him that the forest did not welcome strangers, that those who entered were claimed by it. But Father Gray believed no place was beyond redemption, and no heart too far gone to return to grace. His first days in the wilderness were uneventful. He followed the river's course deeper into the mountains until he began to notice strange signs carved into the bark of trees, spirals, eyes, and circles, identical to those that appeared in the rumors. The forest grew unnaturally quiet the farther he went, as though it were listening. Then, one evening, through a break in the mist, he saw the outline of towering wooden walls hidden between the trees. Smoke rose from within, and faint voices carried through the fog. Convinced he had found the lost family, he crossed himself, whispered a prayer, and approached the gate. The doors opened without a sound, as if expecting him. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the faint metallic scent of blood. Men and women in rough-spun garments moved slowly through the settlement, their faces blank, their eyes distant. They did not speak but hummed softly in unison, their rhythm echoing through the stillness. At the center of the compound stood a great wooden structure carved with symbols, its entrance guarded by children who looked both young and impossibly ancient. Father Gray entered, clutching his cross tightly, and what he saw inside shattered his faith. The temple's walls were lined with bones arranged in spirals, candles flickering between them. A figure sat on a throne of branches, crowned with antlers, his skin pale and his eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. The priest realized this was no ordinary family, they were worshipping something far older than the God he knew. He tried to speak, to denounce their rituals, but his voice faltered. The chanting grew louder, the candles dimmed, and the air turned cold. When the doors opened again, Father Gray was gone. Only his rosary remained, lying at the foot of the gate, its beads cracked and blackened as though they had been burned. Years after Father Gray vanished, the Wren family's kingdom began to change in ways even they could not ignore. What started as whispers of illness soon turned into something far more sinister. It began quietly, children born with pale, translucent skin, eyes that reflected light like glass, and strange, shuddering tremors that no herbal cure could soothe. The elders spoke of it as a divine trial, a test of purity sent to separate the weak from the chosen. But the sickness did not stop with the children. It crept through the family like a curse, twisting bones, clouding minds, and leaving its victims in a fevered delirium that often ended in screams echoing through the forest. At first, they believed the forest itself was punishing them for some broken vow. Offerings were made in the old ways, fires lit through the night as the family chanted prayers in their secret tongue. Yet no matter how many sacrifices they offered, food, blood, or even their own kin, the sickness spread. Faces once proud and strong became hollow, their features distorted until they scarcely resembled human. Some lost their speech entirely, communicating only through guttural hums and symbols scratched into wood. The elders declared that these transformations were signs of evolution, that the bloodline was ascending beyond mortal form, shedding human weakness for divine perfection. But in the shadows of their worship, fear began to grow. Some whispered that the sickness was not divine at all, that their bodies were collapsing under generations of the same blood binding together. Mothers wept in silence for their deformed children, only to be silenced by the council, who claimed sorrow was a sin against destiny. Graves began to appear behind the walls, shallow and hastily covered, their number growing too quickly to count. Yet no one dared to speak the truth aloud, for even a hint of doubt was seen as blasphemy. As years passed, the illness took more than bodies, it took sanity. Laughter echoed through the nights, mingled with cries that no longer sounded human. The boundaries between faith and madness dissolved completely. The family stopped burying their dead, believing their remains carried divine power. Bones were used in rituals, arranged into patterns that lined the walls and floors of their temples. The once living kingdom of the Wrens had become a shrine to its own decay. The air grew heavy with rot and incense, and the forest around their compound darkened, as if nature itself recoiled from what the family had become. They called it purification, but the woods called it something else, a slow, inevitable extinction masked as worship. Among the few who still clung to fragments of reason within the Wren family's decaying kingdom was a young woman named Clara Wren. She was born into a world where obedience was life and silence was holiness, but unlike others, she carried questions she dared not voice. From a young age, she noticed the sickness spreading through her kin, the trembling hands, the vacant eyes, the hollowed faces that seemed to forget who they were. The elders called it transcendence, but Clara saw only suffering. She tended to the sick, watched children die before their names were even recorded, and began to suspect that the family's purity was slowly destroying them from within. The walls that surrounded their compound, once symbols of divine protection, began to feel like the bars of a cage tightening around her. Her doubts deepened the night she discovered the truth behind the sacred rituals. Following the sound of chanting, she hid among the trees and witnessed the council performing a ceremony that froze her blood. They stood around a circle of fire, whispering in their ancient tongue, while a child was offered as a sacrifice to appease whatever they believed ruled over them. The flames consumed the small body as the family sang, their faces twisted in a frenzy that no longer looked human. Clara fled before anyone noticed, her heart pounding with a terror she could barely comprehend. For the first time, she understood that what her ancestors had built was not a kingdom but a prison of madness. Days later, she decided to escape. She waited for a stormy night when the guards took shelter from the rain and slipped through a gap in the outer wall that she had been secretly widening for months. She ran barefoot through the forest, guided only by flashes of lightning and the sound of the river she had once been forbidden to approach. The air seemed alive, whispering her name, as if the woods themselves were warning her to turn back. But Clara did not stop. Behind her, the faint hum of chanting began to rise, spreading through the trees like an echo chasing her. After days of wandering, starving, and half-mad from exhaustion, she stumbled into a small mountain town. The locals found her collapsed near a creek, her clothes torn and covered in mud, her eyes wide with fear. She spoke of a family that lived like kings in the forest, of rituals, bones, and a sickness that made people forget their own names. Many dismissed her as delirious, but others saw the carvings etched into her arms, symbols that matched the ones found on ancient trees deep in the woods, and realized her story was not madness but warning. The story Clara told spread quickly through the small mountain towns, carried by whispers and unease. At first, no one wanted to believe her. Her words spoke of a hidden kingdom, of rituals and sickness, of people who worshipped something that was not human. But as more hunters and trappers began to vanish near the same stretch of forest she described, fear turned into curiosity, and curiosity into resolve. A group of locals, hardened by the wilderness and driven by a mix of courage and superstition, decided to uncover the truth for themselves. They gathered torches, rifles, and provisions, and set out into the woods with Clara's trembling directions guiding them. Some believed they would find nothing but an abandoned settlement, the remnants of a long-forgotten cult. Others feared they would find proof of something far worse. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air began to change. The sound of birds and insects faded until only the crunch of their boots and the rustling of leaves remained. Strange carvings began to appear on the trees, circles, eyes, and twisted symbols burned into the bark. The men exchanged uneasy glances but pressed forward, following a trail that seemed to appear and vanish in the mist. After several miles, they came upon a clearing, and there it was, the Wren family's kingdom, untouched by time yet consumed by decay. The fortress loomed before them, built entirely of wood and bone, its walls impossibly tall and covered in carvings that seemed to shift when the torchlight flickered across them. Skulls and feathers hung from the gates like trophies, and the scent of rot seeped through the damp air. No sound came from within, only the soft creak of the wind pushing against the structures. The men hesitated, but curiosity overcame fear, and they pushed the gates open. Inside, they found a village frozen in ruin. Huts leaned and splintered, altars stood covered in blackened wax, and bones littered the ground in careful, deliberate patterns. It was as if the inhabitants had vanished in an instant, leaving behind a world built entirely for the dead. Then, one of the men found a book bound in human skin, filled with writing none of them could read. The symbols matched the ones Clara bore on her arms. Another discovered a pit behind the temple, lined with skulls stacked neatly, each marked with a single carved eye. As night began to fall, a thick mist rolled through the trees, swallowing their torches one by one. The forest grew silent again, but this time the silence felt alive, breathing. When morning came, only 2 of the searchers stumbled back to town, pale and trembling, their minds fractured. They refused to speak of what they saw, only muttering one thing again and again, that the family had never left. As the last light of day vanished behind the jagged peaks, the men who remained inside the Wren family's fortress began to realize that something was very wrong. The mist had thickened, curling through the wooden streets like living smoke, swallowing the torches they carried until only dim orange halos remained. The air was heavy, damp, and humming with a low vibration that seemed to rise from the ground itself. One man swore he heard footsteps echoing through the mist, slow and deliberate, though no one could see who, or what, was moving. They tried to call out, their voices breaking the silence, but the sound died quickly, as if the forest absorbed it. The longer they stayed, the more the air seemed to pulse, each breath of wind carrying a faint whisper that sounded almost human. When they reached the center of the compound, they found the main hall, an enormous wooden structure that towered above the others, its entrance draped in tattered fabric painted with symbols. Inside, the walls were covered in strange drawings depicting figures bowing before a radiant tree whose roots were tangled around skulls. The floorboards were stained black, sticky to the touch, and smelled faintly of decay. At the far end stood a throne made of twisted wooden antlers. Upon it rested something that had once been a person. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, the mouth frozen in a silent scream, and its eyes were missing. Yet the body looked freshly preserved, as though it had not been dead long. Then came the sound, soft, almost like breathing, but coming from all around them. The men turned, and through the fog, shapes began to appear. At first they thought they were statues, human figures standing motionless in the dark. But as the light flickered, the figures moved. Slowly, unnaturally. Their limbs were bent at wrong angles, their faces pale and expressionless, eyes reflecting the torchlight like glass. They were the Wrens, or what was left of them. Generations of sickness and madness had transformed them into something beyond human, bodies warped and minds hollowed. They watched in silence, heads tilting in unison, as if recognizing the intruders not as strangers but as prey. The men fired their guns, but the sound barely pierced the thick air. The creatures didn't flinch. One by one, the lights went out, and screams cut through the dark. When morning came, the fortress was silent once more, the gates open and the forest untouched. No bodies were ever found, only footprints that ended at the edge of the clearing, and symbols freshly carved into the trees, as if welcoming the next visitors to their kingdom. Decades passed, and the Wren family's kingdom faded into local legend. The stories became the kind that parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. Hunters avoided the area entirely, and maps marked the region only with empty green space. Time buried the memory of the family beneath dust and disbelief, until the old settlement was little more than a whisper traded in bars and around campfires. But the forest never truly let go of what it had claimed. Those who lived nearby said that some nights, when the fog was thick and the moon was thin, they could still hear faint singing carried on the wind, a tune that rose and fell like prayer. Most dismissed it as imagination. Others quietly locked their doors and left candles burning until dawn. One autumn afternoon, nearly a century later, a group of hikers stumbled upon something deep in those same woods. The trail they followed was not on any map, but it felt worn, as if countless feet had once walked it. The trees grew close together, their bark marked with faint carvings that time and moss had tried to hide. Then, as the forest opened into a clearing, they saw it, a cluster of ruins, half buried in roots and soil, the remnants of a vast wooden settlement. The air there was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath. The hikers moved cautiously through the ruins, their footsteps echoing faintly against hollow wood. They found remnants of lives long gone, rusted tools, decayed furniture, and a massive throne splintered and collapsed in the center of what must have been a hall. But the strangest discovery lay in the soil itself. Beneath the collapsed structures were skeletal remains, hundreds of them, arranged in deliberate patterns. Some were found kneeling in circles, others holding hands as if frozen in worship. Near the base of the largest tree, they uncovered a stone tablet carved with words so worn they were barely legible. When one of the hikers brushed away the dirt, the faint inscription came into view, "We tried to be gods." The phrase chilled them more than the cold wind that blew through the ruins. It was both confession and curse, the final mark of a family that had turned their faith into madness. Before leaving, one of the hikers took a photo of the clearing, but when they later looked at it, the trees seemed closer, the shadows darker, and faintly in the background, the outline of figures watching from between the trunks. The forest had hidden its secret for generations, and it seemed in no hurry to let it go.